Welcome to Understand Murdaugh, a podcast from the Post and Courier, South Carolina's largest newspaper. Our award-winning reporters have spent more than a year digging into the Murdaugh saga to bring you the latest news and in-depth analysis as we cover this story of drugs, deceit, and death in South Carolina's rural lowcountry. Today, we return with Glenn Smith and Avery Wilks on the second part of our Murdaugh recap, giving you the full story so far of this twisting and turning saga.
Yeah, and you got to remember, too, so this shooting, staged suicide, it occurs over Labor Day weekend, right? It's already months have gone by now since the shooting of Maggie and Paul. There's no discernible progress in the case. People were still, freaked out in the area about this, who's out there doing this. Now the patriarch of the family has been shot in the head. So there's, all this commotion over this. Again, very little coming out of the official sources to fill this vacuum. And, he's airlifted to the hospital with a head wound. And then, a couple days later, these revelations, money's missing from the firm. That's sort of the apology from him that he's let all these people down. And even worse, he's taken the eye off the ball, taken attention away from the hunt for Maggie and Paul's killer. That needs to be the preeminent thing. His attorneys appear on morning shows talking about a separate investigation, still looking for those killer or killers, and that there may be some promising leads that they plan to turn over to investigators. And then when the charges are filed against him for staging this thing, suddenly, Murdaugh is hauled into court, pulled back from this drug rehab place in Georgia. And lo and behold, nobody sees any sign of a head wound. He's been shot in the head, yet it doesn't even look like he's at a shaved spot where somebody might have touched up the wound. So again, that begins what really happened here, and all sorts of new conspiracy theories emerge.
So a few days after this Labor Day shooting, a lawsuit is filed that really cracks open the lid on what we now know as Alec Murdaugh's financial schemes over the past decade. The lawsuit is filed on behalf of Gloria Satterfield's sons. Gloria Satterfield was the longtime housekeeper and nanny for the Murdaugh family. She had died in early 2018 after a trip and fall on the steps of the Murdaugh's family home. This lawsuit really starts to show what PMPED had earlier alleged when they say that that Murdaugh had stolen from people who trusted him. So the lawsuit, which was later amended as the attorneys Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter learned more about this scheme, essentially alleges a conspiracy by Alec Murdaugh, the local bank, Palmetto State Bank, and one of Alec's buddies, Beaufort attorney Corey Fleming. And it says that after the death of Gloria Satterfield, Murdaugh approached her sons at the funeral and encouraged them to file a wrongful death claim against them. And he says they can get some money if they do that. He encourages them to hire Corey Fleming. He does not tell them that Corey Fleming is a longtime friend of his, a college roommate, went to law school with him, and also the godfather of his youngest son, Paul. So they hire Corey Fleming to represent them. Fleming brings this wrongful death claim against Murdaugh, and he negotiates two settlements on their behalf from Murdaugh's two insurance policies worth $4.3 million. They are encouraged to hire a guy named Chad Westendorf, who is the vice president of Palmetto State Bank, to represent them and handle the money. Oddly, they are not told about the fact that the settlement even exists. So Westendorf, by his own ambition, really falls down on the job here. It takes a couple years for the Satterfields to actually realize that the settlements were negotiated on their behalf. And that's when they filed the lawsuit to figure out what happened to the money and where it went. Ultimately, as this lawsuit develops, it is determined that the money was essentially stolen by Alec Murdaugh. He had Corey Fleming send the money to a fraudulent bank account that he created and named Forge, which is the name of a financial institution in Atlanta that actually creates structured settlements for people who win lawsuits or settlements. But this Forge account just belonged to Alec Murdaugh, and he used it to essentially take the money that was supposed to go for the Satterfield sons to himself. It was about $3.4 million that he wound up stealing. So this is the first major scheme that Murdaugh is accused of carrying out, leveraging his relationships with other attorneys and with bankers to basically divert legal settlements that were owed to his clients and people who trusted him, and basically divert them to himself, that he used to pay down debts, pay back friends, personal loans. And this is really what begins to snowball into what we now see as, dozens of criminal indictments, nearly a dozen lawsuits that accuse Murdaugh of stealing roughly $9 million from his law partners, his legal clients, and other people who, like the Satterfields, trusted him.
Yeah, and the Satterfield case also begins to pull the lid off some of the connections that Alec Murdaugh has in the community to powerful figures. Just as the boat crash did. Here's a situation where the judge presiding over the settlements, Circuit Judge Carmen Mullen, was one of the judges who had recused herself from the boat crash case. She never stated a reason for doing so, but had clearly had ties to the Murdaugh family. She was in the same law school class at the University of South Carolina as both Murdaugh and Corey Fleming, the other attorney in the case. Interestingly enough, Chad Westendorf from Palmetto State Bank, he had been selected to be the family's personal representative. Now what that is somebody who's supposed to look out for the family's interests and make sure that everything is being done by the books. And it's one of the guardrails in place in South Carolina's probate system to make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen. So a deposition emerges in which Chad Westendorf says that he was never really told what he was supposed to do in that role. He never spoke with the family by phone or in person, had no idea who they were, and sat there in some of these hearings and had no clue what he was supposed to be doing. Nobody was telling him, so he just sort of sat there. And he tells a story about the settlement basically being approved, one of the settlements being approved in a chambers meeting with Judge Mullen, Fleming, Murdaugh, and that the judge, in his telling of the story, allows the settlement not to be put on the books, which he took as a sort of a favor to Murdaugh, I guess, to not put it on the books so that the attorneys in the boat crash case would not really get a clue as to what his insurance coverage was or what means he had and what his payout was in that case. So the settlement never gets filed. We still haven't really heard from Judge Mullen as to what her version of that event is. A couple complaints have been filed, one by Bland, the attorney for the Satterfield family, another by First Circuit solicitor David Pascoe, questioning the judge's actions in that case, and that's gone to the state judicial watchdog for investigation. That's been about 6 months or so since those complaints have been filed, and we haven't heard anything from them as to the status of that investigation.
Yet another case, in this saga that raises major questions about, the benefit of the doubt that the Murdaughs enjoyed in this corner of South Carolina, their relationship with other lawyers and judges, and how they leveraged their name and their relationship to influence the administration of justice in the 14th Circuit. So really, this Satterfield case, it starts the ball down the hill, and it begins sort of a snowball effect, and it leads to criminal indictments and more lawsuits. And suddenly, people who were represented by Murdaugh over the years are looking into their own cases, and the law firm PMPED, they're looking into Murdaugh's past cases to see where he may have misappropriated money, They're turning over their findings to law enforcement. A state grand jury is probing these alleged financial crimes as part of a web of criminal investigations into the Murdaugh family. Over the past year, on sort of a rolling basis, Murdaugh has been indicted on dozens and dozens of financial crimes, basically alleging that he used, in many cases, that same fraudulent bank account, the forge account, to siphon money away from his legal clients, millions and millions of dollars in settlements that they didn't even know they were owed. These are legal agreements, payouts that he negotiated on their behalf, and they may have gotten a slice of that money, but they did not know, reportedly, the total amount they were supposed to get. And so Murdaugh was just essentially pocketing, the rest. And, we know that he had major financial problems. His bank accounts were overdrawn. And so he's taking this money that's supposed to go to his clients, and he's paying off personal debts. He's paying off family members. He's paying down, all kinds of debts and shoring up his bank account. And so the state grand jury sort of has a field day with this. And other people get charged. Corey Fleming gets charged by the state grand jury. Eventually, Curtis Edward Smith gets charged with laundering the money that Murdaugh is taking and using some of it, at least, to buy drugs and pills for Murdaugh's use. So it really, the Satterfield settlement scheme and the lawsuit that unraveled it really leads to a ton of revelations about Murdaugh's financial crimes that come out in further lawsuits and in criminal indictments.
Yeah, the coziness with which the system down in Hampton County operated, both within the court system and in the community. The Murdaugh family had a lot of power and clout, and I think it earned trust over time because they did favors for people. Alec was generally well regarded before all this. I think he'd even served as president of the State Trial Lawyers Association. And I think a lot of the people that have been swept up in this case, Corey Fleming, Curtis Edward Smith, and Russell Laffitte, the former president of Palmetto State Bank, who lost his job in the wake of all this, have really tried to say, hey, we weren't at fault here. We fell under his charm, and we were just as much victims as the people who got ripped off, and we don't deserve to be held criminally liable for the actions. What do you think about the fact that Alec Murdaugh has not been indicted as well, since his name turns up all over this indictment and the amended indictment against Lafitte? He's been sort of this unindicted co-conspirator in this all. What do you think the strategy of the feds are that we don't see him facing charges just yet?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of evidence there that Murdaugh may have committed financial crimes. So it's a fair question to ask, why haven't they indicted him, the feds? One easy answer, and I don't know for sure that this is their thinking, is that if the federal government indicts Murdaugh, he's very likely to just plead guilty to those charges and get sent to a federal prison. Not sure how many people know this, but if you ever get into legal trouble, you would much rather live in federal prison than the State Department of Corrections, especially if you get sent to a minimum security federal prison. Your quality of life is going to be much, much better than if you are at a state correctional institution. So my guess is that maybe the feds don't want to give Murdaugh an easy out. And they don't want him to spend, the first 10 or 20 years of his sentence in a cozy federal institution. So this sort of, and who knows? I mean, they may eventually come in and file charges against him. But my guess is that there's going to be some, it's going to be a game of timing. And they could potentially wait until the double murder trial, which is a state trial, has been resolved. And, if it turns out that Murdaugh is destined for a state prison, then you might see the feds come in and charge him with federal crimes.
The first of the many Murdaugh legal cases to reach trial involved Russell Lafitte, a 51-year-old former banker from Hampton, a friend of the Murdaugh family. His family owns the Palmetto State Bank. And Lafitte went to trial in November in federal court on 6 federal fraud counts for helping disbarred attorney Alec Murdaugh steal nearly $2 million from his clients. Lafitte's trial lasted 8 days in federal court. So he was accused of diverting Murdaugh's client's settlement checks to the lawyer's benefit at his direction. Lafitte deposited the funds into accounts belonging to Murdaugh, his family members, and those he owed debts to. He's also accused of misusing bank funds to cover Murdaugh's debts and negative balances on his bank accounts, and to repay a former client whose funds had been stolen. Lafitte's charges stem not only from his role as an executive at his family's bank, but in a separate role as a court-appointed custodian of some Murdaugh clients' settlement funds. He has said that he deposited their checks on Murdaugh's behalf. He didn't notice their names on the memo lines. So this case, again, the first one to go to trial, lasted 8 days, really painstakingly dove into all sorts of arcane banking rules and regulations, probate issues, and some heartrending testimony from people who had been victimized. Came to a head on November 22nd when it goes to the jury. They deliberate 10 hours without reaching a verdict. Then it looks like the case is falling apart at night after they have this pizza dinner. The jury comes back, there's these notes going to the judge saying one lady says apparently that she needs to take an antibiotic. Another person complains of anxiety issues. And then there's some note that comes to the judge that indicates jurors are having problems with someone on the panel who is hostile to deliberating. Looks like there's no way they're going to reach a verdict that night, maybe even never. Suddenly, 2 jurors are replaced. They go back into deliberating, and shortly thereafter, they have a verdict, and Lafitte is found guilty on all 6 counts. And he hasn't been sentenced yet. He was sent home that night. He's going to be free on bail till they figure that out, but he faces some pretty stiff stuff. He was convicted on 1 count each of bank fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy, plus 3 counts of misapplication of bank funds. Each of the 6 charges carries a maximum sentence of up to 30 years in prison, $1 million fine, or both. It remains to be seen if he'll get all that time or a portion of it. It'll be interesting. It'll probably take several weeks, if not months, to issue a pre-sentence report and delve into some of the factors of his crimes, his life, and possibility for rehabilitation. They'll have to consider the federal sentencing guidelines. Also unclear what this means for Murdaugh. He hasn't been charged in the federal system yet, but that could be because they were trying to see how the case would play here and to use that as possible leverage against him. So stay tuned on that. Next up, it looks like we'll see the actual murder trial itself. The double murder case is scheduled for January 23rd in Colleton County, where the murders occurred, and it looks like it's proceeding as planned. There had been plans to try the boat crash case in which Mallory Beach was killed on January 9th, but on the same day a jury was deliberating Lafitte's fate, a separate judge opted to move that trial in the boat crash case to sometime in April. Murdaugh's attorneys had argued that it was really unfair to have him try to prepare for his double murder case while also trying to defend himself in the boat crash case. There was also some concern he might be asked about things that could have implications on his murder trial, and I don't think anyone wanted to risk an appeal in that case. So it looks like January 23rd for the murders, and then sometime in April for the boat crash.
That's all for now. As always, stay tuned with the Post and Courier for the latest updates in this case. You can follow along at postandcourier.com/Murdaugh-updates. Follow us on Twitter at Post and Courier. And we encourage you to send questions, feedback, and tips to our Murdaugh email address. That's murdaugh@postandcourier.com. Today's episode was hosted by Avery, Wilks, and Glenn Smith. Produced by Nathan Stevens. Music provided by Alexa Music. We'll see you next time.